Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The IMF is forecasting that the global economy will roar back to life this year, with especially powerful rebounds in the US and China. Well, the biggest risk right now is still the pandemic, but the way out of the crisis is increasingly invisible. So how will the strong recovery of the world's two biggest economies reshape the outlook, and what challenges and risks are still ahead? To talk about those issues and more, I'm joined by Liu Zhiqin, Senior Fellow from the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University, Hong Hao, Chief Strategist, Bank of Communications International, and Dr. William Li, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. So, gentlemen, let me start with the latest IMF forecast. It has upgraded the global economic growth forecast for the second time in 3 months. The strongest recovery will come from the two largest economies, the US and China. First of all, Mr. Liu, why do you think the IMF is modifying its forecast up?
I believe that it's not surprising to everybody in the world that we have the positive forecast from IMF. Not only from IMF, from other international organizations, we can see all the positive upgrade of this economic outlook in the year to come. So for China and the US, I think we have enough reasons that to be upgraded from the economic growth in this year after two reasons. The first reason is that the pandemic outbreak is under control. Even in the United States, I think the situation is getting better after the new Biden administration came into the White House. Now, of course, China remains the best country and the destination that put all this outbreak under control, and also is the first country that have the positive growth in the economic development last year, even during the very difficult time. So from both countries that they have always work hard to improve the productivities and to get all this economic situation improved. This is the main reason that for all these two powers that in the economic recovery. We hope that this tendency will remain unchanged in the short time.
And Hong Hao, do you agree that actually COVID control sooner or later is the major contributor to the growth? Because Europe obviously is still questionable because the COVID resurgence again.
Yeah, I think the spread of the virus is still hindering the recovery of the global economy. But from China's experience, last year, China has contained the virus effectively, and as a result, the Chinese economy started to rebound in the second half of last year, and I think the recovery is getting momentum. I think in the U.S., since Biden administration came on board, I think the vaccine rollout in the U.S. has been very aggressive. So as a result, we're seeing positive economic feedback as well. I think Europe, somehow is having a little bit of problem, a little bit of issues with their virus containment. But even so, if you look at the expectation components of the European economic statistics, they're still showing very significant improvement from last year, mostly because of very low base.
Let's look at the growth predictions. For China is 8.4%, 0.3% above the previous prediction. And the US is forecast to grow at 6.4% in 2021. And those actually are the most strongest growth in decades. But do they mean the same thing for the two economies, Hong Hao?
I would say, strong growth coming from two biggest economies in the world, must be good news for the world as a whole. I think, China is continue its rebound, because investment growth is still very solid, and I think consumption is coming back. So during a cyclical recovery, firstly, you would have an upstream recovery, which has happened in the second half of last year, and now I think consumption is starting to pick up steam. So if you look at, for example, the tourism statistics during the Qingming Festival, we have more number of tourists domestically compared to last year, same period. So I would say that the U.S. Is seeing very strong upstream cyclical recovery, and I think the strength of the recovery will start to spread downstream into the consumption sectors. And so as a result, you can see, for example, the cruise industry, the airline industry is rebounding very strongly.
You mean the U.S.?
In the U.S., yes.
And Dr. Li, of course, the big backdrop is that U.S. and China is locked in economic competition, probably the fiercest ever in history. So what does economic recovery mean for the competitive part of the two economies?
Well, the huge numbers that Mr. Hu just cited are not sustainable. I think we all recognize that after about a year or so, the two economies, both the United States and China, will come back down to their more natural rates of growth. In the case of China, it's probably somewhere between 5 and 6%. In the case of the United States, it's actually much lower, close to about 2%. So the key is, for the future, the competition between the United States and China is going to have to set a framework for trade, a framework for exchange of intellectual property, opening up of markets in both countries that will be able to sustain continued growth in both countries, so that not only is the growth going to be important, but also the spread of employment and the benefits of growth will be more widespread to the populations of both countries and also the rest of the world. The imbalance of growth right now is one of the huge problems facing the world economy, as the IMF has pointed out in its World Economic Outlook.
Mr. Liu, Biden has just passed a 1.9 trillion stimulus bill and is on his way to pass another 3 trillion stimulus infrastructure bill. What does it mean for American economy, and what does it mean for the Chinese economy?
I believe that the stimulus from the Biden administration is quite positive, but we have to see another factor, because we see that in the history all these former U.S. government and administrations have the similar stimulus plan that they never come into enforce. That means that they have never or have difficulty to realize all these plans in full shape or in full time. This is the question for the administration's plan. Even the 1.9 trillion yuan, whether all this budget and money could be injected into infrastructure or in other different sectors, this is still a question under debate. At the moment, I don't think that all this stimulus will come into force and have direct effect on the business environment in the United States. And it will take some time that for this plan to come to realize that. But still, we see that there are some uncertainties. Plan is plan, practice is others. So I hope that the both should be good combined together by the U.S. administration.
When we're talking about trillions of money's stimulus, we reminded of the 4 trillion yuan stimulus package that China practiced in 2009. Is there any similarities there? Because we are still living the consequences with overloaded liquidity and overburdens of production capacity.
Actually, if we compare the Chinese stimulus in almost 10 years before, that is different from what they have today in the U.S. At that time, we put all this 4 trillion renminbi not only in the infrastructure project, but also in the livelihood and also the under industrialization processing. So in this way that we have very good diversified all this investment and the money injection. We have not caused any inflation and other or deflation, so those concerns. But nowadays, if we see the plan from the United States is totally different from what we had years before, because the 1.9 trillion US dollar for US is something under debate from political sides that they are not settled even. So they need a long time to get all this problem and disputes solved. And whether all this stimulus can take effect on the economic development, we need some time, at least I think 4 to 6 months to see the reality.
So Dr. Li, are economists in the U.S. worry about inflation, a faster recovery in the U.S. could it mean the interest rate rise down the road?
That's a great question. That's probably at the center of the debate among all economists in the United States and the rest of the world, because there are two competing trends here. The bottled up opening of the U.S. economy, the very rapid rates of growth that we just talked about, are surely going to create bottlenecks and supply chain issues where prices will suddenly jump because everyone wants to buy the same things at the same time. And so we should expect a short-term burst of prices. But there's deflationary forces that have been acting on the U.S. and global economy for the last 10 years. From China, the trade of lower priced goods, and also the huge productivity increases that have gone into the service sector of the United States economy because of new technologies and the reorganization of how services are being produced. So those deflationary forces are really quite strong and will probably come back into play once the burst of spending subsides in about a year or so. So I personally believe that the rise in inflation will be severe. It'll be probably above 2.5–3% for about 6 months to a year. But then, as the Federal Reserve forecast suggests, it'll come back down to that 2% or even below in the 3 or 4 years out horizon. And that medium-term horizon is what the Fed cares about. So the likelihood of short-term interest rates or policy rates going up is very small. Right now, long-term interest rates have gone up tremendously by about a percentage point over the last 6 months or so. But you see already that has overshot. And we see that in the last week or so, the long-term interest rates have come down from 1.77 to 1.65. So there's really a cap to the degree to which markets are anticipating the rise in inflation. Right now, inflation expectations are well anchored at 2.25%.
What is the international aspect of this, Hong Hao? Because it seems that there is increasing signs of capital flowing to the U.S. because of the economic recovery and the bond yield increase. Will the developing economy suffer as a result?
I would say it is not surprising, because the strength is now with the U.S. economy. We're seeing a very rapid recovery in U.S. economic data. So, and also the U.S. capital markets, especially the stock market, is performing very well. So it's not surprising to see, portfolio flow into the U.S. To buy into the U.S. capital markets. But I think at the same time, because we're talking about a global recovery story, all right. So the U.S. dollar strength not only reflects the U.S. economic strength, but also a sort of a synchronized global recovery. So I think even though the U.S. market can run stronger than the rest of the world, but then at the same time we're not seeing the emerging market being the loser here, unless the inflation, near-term inflation, getting out of control.
But you don't think the near-term inflation rate will get out of control because you believe the regulators keep an eye on it?
I don't believe in regulators. I think they're always slow to the game, and I think they're very skillful in sort of deceiving the market, making the market to believe that there's no imminent danger of rising inflation. And I think the long-term bond yield has already proven that the danger of rising inflation in the near term is very real. But I think the problem really is what kind of monetary tool they can apply to calm down the bond market, and also as a result, how much rising bond yield can impair the sort of a nascent recovery that's still unfolding. So I would say that it remains to be seen, but I think in the near term, I think the U.S. market can go higher from here.
Mr. Liu, China has been saying financial stability is key this year for China. Technological innovation is key. what should China be guarding against?
You know, the financial stability is always as the priority of the policy making since the past 10 years. Every year's conference, we always announce and stress this significant importance to keep the financial stability, because this is the key and the lifeline of our economic development. At the moment, I think China has some still uncertainties and also have to deal some serious challenges ahead. Not only the pandemic outbreak, but also from the business climate outside of China is getting worse, and Western countries are getting together for small groups, not direct as the former U.S. administration, the unilateral policy, but they have the group unilateral policy. The small group clique get together to deal with the Chinese emerging economy. So this is the point that for China's financial sections. At the moment, we know that China is trying to open up widely, especially in the financial sector. In the last 2 years, China has issued different policies announced to open up. This is the unique country that China, like China, to open its windows and the doors, and even the walls already disappeared. That we welcome all the investors coming into China's capital market, the bond market, even the stock market. So some people are afraid of that the war is really coming. What we should do, we should prevent. So, but actually, I think our authority and regulator still keep a clear and a clean mind that to be alert against any uncertainties and possible risk. This is very important for China's financial stability.
Talking about financial stability, another related issue is debt, especially corporate debt. IMF also urges the Chinese financial authorities to reduce corporate debt risks. So, Mr. Liu, do you think that corporate debt is something that we should be aware of, and what needs to happen to decrease the exposure to risks?
The use of leverage has been something that the U.S. Has always been concerned about. When I was at the Federal Reserve and the IMF, I used to carry around a chart that showed the level of debt relative to GDP, non-financial corporate debt, and it's always been rising. And one of the concerns that we have is that whether or not corporates are going to be under so much pressure that they won't have sufficient profits to pay off all this rising debt. Now, of course, with interest rates as low as they are, that's less of a problem. And in fact, I now carry around a chart that shows the level of debt relative to corporate assets. And that's actually been declining because the value of the assets owned by the companies, the use of the debt has been to produce these assets, has actually been falling. So in that sense, the dangers of debt are really contained because the value of the assets it produces has become so much more valuable. I think the financial stability threats actually are coming from other sources like innovation. The fintech revolution and digital currencies is something that's threatening the entire banking structure around the world. JP Morgan has issued a letter, Jamie Dimon's famous letter, points to the rise of fintech and digital currencies as the greatest threat to the banking system. And this is something that I know China has been dealing with in its own regulatory framework. But China has been on the forefront of issuing digital currency. So I think the U.S. has got some catching up to do in terms of reconciling how to integrate fintech firms with the banking system, at the same time be able to deal with digital currency transfers, both digital currencies issued by governments and also digital currencies issued by non-governments.
So you believe fintech might pose a threat to the financial stability. What about you, Hong Hao? What do you think is the biggest threat to China's financial stability?
Well, I think at this moment, it's the property bubble. I think the authority has been, trying very hard to contain it. For example, today we've learned that there's window guidance for Chinese commercial banks not to lend above last year's total lending amount. All right, so immediately the market, react very badly to a certain extent. So, I think people are watching the Chinese property sector to see, what kind of new policy is coming out, and also, because property price is at such high level, any mistake or any sort of
but the government is all over it to avoid speculative impulses.
That's right. That's right. But I think if you look at the property price inflation data since the beginning of this year, you're seeing very strong surge in property price across the board, and also we're seeing some illegal speculations going on in the property sector. People are borrowing money from very unauthorized channel and apply those loans to property sector to speculate in the property sector to jack up the price. So it is a monumental task for the authority to contain the property bubble here.
Mr. Liu, another debatable area is technology front. Obviously, China and the U.S. has joined a technology competition for supremacy. But when the two economies are growing fast and back to normal track, will that change?
I mean that it could becoming more serious or maybe more losing. Both possibilities are still existing. But I think from the philosophy, from the principle of the U.S. administration, it's strongly that alert against China's uprising, especially in the technology field. So that's why they are always worried that China will surpass the United States by high technology. So this is what they are worried, what they are concerned. So in this way, that we should say that the competition between China and the U.S. in the high-tech technology, even transfer, innovation, or AI technologies, so we're becoming sharper than ever. But we hope that all this competition could be conducted and based on the transparency, on the friendly respect, on the right way, rational competition. We don't
but the two sides have different definitions of what is the right way to do.
Yes, that's true. But the right way to do is according to the international law. The international law is always issued by WTO or some other international organization. Should not be one country's domestic policy. This is not dominating the policy for all other countries. But the U.S. always try to govern or to have a long-arm management or governance to other countries. This is the point that is not a competition. This is something different from we understood the rational competition. So we hope that China could carry up and become more careful and also try to do the best to find their own way to develop its own technology, that we can have a good competition with the United States, but we do not to say whether we should die, whether we should live. So from both that only the middle way, that we should have a best way for both sides. Even Chinese companies still like the United States or U.S. companies to be uprised also in the technology field. We learned from each other. So that's why we should compare and learn each other with all these companies in the high technologies. But technologies is still the lifeline from both sides.
Oh, so how will they deal with the lifeline, and which part covers the longer part of it? Dr. Li, your take on this?
Yeah, I think Mr. Liu has a fantastic point and I want to emphasize again what he just said.